Um, Good afternoon, and welcome to the EPA Alumni Association Academy program on climate momentum after Glasgow. I'm Derry Allen, a member of the board of the EPA Alumni Association. Most of the people that we're going to have on here this afternoon are EPA alumni. We're going to have a few EPA staff who told me that they're going to be on. We're grateful to the EPA staff for what they're doing. And we're going to have a few students, I understand, as well. And so welcome to the students. Our speaker today is Dan Esty. He's a proud member of the EPA Alumni Association. And he is currently a professor at Yale University. We've sent you the link to his bio, so I'm not going to recite it for you. Let's just say that his resume is long and impressive. Of importance to us today, in 1989, after a couple of years after he graduated from Yale Law School, he came to EPA to work for Administrator Bill Riley, first as special assistant, then as deputy chief of staff, and then as deputy assistant administrator for policy, which is when I met him. And among other things, in that tour of duty at EPA, he was a member of the US delegation to the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, which established the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, part of which is the Conference of the Parties, or the COP process that we've all become familiar with. In 1994, he joined the faculty of Yale University, where he's remained active on climate and a host of other major environmental policy issues. That he's worked on a lot of issues relating to sustainability and innovation. And whenever I want to know what's the next big idea for the planet, I look towards Dan Esty. In 2011 to 2014, he took leave from Yale to be the commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And while he was there, he worked to shift away from command and control to market-based approaches to spur innovation. He focused on renewable power and energy efficiency finance programs, including Connecticut's first in the nation Green Bank. So he has state and energy experience as well as environmental. This past year, he attended COP26 in Glasgow. It's been my pleasure to remain in touch with Dan during his tenure at Yale. Dan is a highly respected professor and public servant. We're very fortunate that he can join us today. He's actually in California right now, but that doesn't make any difference on Zoom. As I mentioned, his topic today is climate momentum after Glasgow. And if you want to see some of his written thoughts on this topic, see his blog post that we put on our website, along with some other materials that he's shared with us. As advertised, we expect that this program will last till 5:15 Eastern time. Dan's going to talk for about half that time, and then he'll take questions. And if you have a question, please use the chat function on your screen, and I'll read the questions to Dan. Don't start yet, though. First, see if he speaks to your question in his presentation. When we get to the 5:15 mark, we're going to end the formal Q&A. We're going to do a quick 2-question evaluation survey, and then give those who want to stick around the opportunity to talk informally in small groups, much like you would if we were together in person. But I'll explain all this later when we get to it. I want to note that we will be recording the panel and the Q&A for people who want to watch them later, but we will not be recording the small informal groups. Before turning the mic over to Dan, I want to note that this program is one of a series of virtual events that the EPA Alumni Association Academy has been organizing. We've done 8 of these so far, and you can see the list and the recordings on our website. We have more in the pipeline, including one on climate and technical solutions through green chemistry and green engineering. When we get to 5:15, we'll be giving you a chance to suggest additional ideas for future programs. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dan. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Derry, it's a great pleasure. Thank you for organizing, and thanks to Beth Craig and Chuck Elkins as well for all that was done to make today's program possible. It, for me, is a huge pleasure, really a joy to be with you, especially with so many of you who I worked with during my time at the EPA. And I just note for all those who were there in the Bill Riley era that it is actually Bill Riley's birthday today. So we can wish him a happy birthday together from our collective position, thinking together about some of the same issues we worked on in that era and continue to be worked on today. So I do want to make this a conversation as quickly as possible. So I will try to confine my opening comment to about a half an hour. And by the way, if there's something super pressing that you want to kind of clarify or push back on, feel free to jump in. It does not need to be a 30-minute run from me followed by Q&A. We could mix it up if that were of interest. And I do want to talk to the question of climate change momentum and where I think things are going after the COP26 gathering in Glasgow in November. It was a pleasure to be there. It's been a joy over now more than 30 years to have been in and out of this climate change negotiation process, going back, as Derry mentioned, to the 1992 Framework Convention, which I had the great privilege to help negotiate as part of the EPA team and under Bill Riley's leadership. One of the things we might note, in fact, is how big a role EPA had in that early era in terms of shaping the international agenda. I think less so in recent times. We can think together about whether that's a good or a bad thing. So I want to reflect on what I think is happening out there as the world commits, I think now in a definitive way, to deep decarbonization, to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And I want to, at the end, come to, I think, 6 points of leverage for driving this transition really to deliver in short order and at scale a clean energy and fully sustainable future. And I'm positing these points of leverage, these critical places to lean in as an opportunity for us all to think about where we can try to make a difference. And one, not to foreshadow in advance too fully the picture, one is transformed policy, which of course is what so many of us have spent a long part of our career on, many of you on this call, a whole career. And I do think it remains important, but frankly, insufficient. So necessary, but not enough. And so I want to think with you about what's further required for a truly, fully sustainable future, and one where the climate change problem has been addressed in a significant way. So let me just, and by the way, along the way, as Derry mentioned, I may point to a couple of places for those who are interested in getting greater depth than we can get into today. Some of the work that I've been doing at Yale, some of the research and writing that my team at the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy has been doing. Particularly, I'll call out the Better Planet book we did a couple of years ago, trying to paint a picture of the elements of what a sustainable future would look like and how we might get there. Derry, in fact, has a chapter in that book. A couple of others on this call have contributed to that research as well. And I do want to say that I think we are at a critical juncture. I think that we have lost time since 1992, when we really first agreed as a global community that climate change needed to be addressed. There are lots of reasons for that, including political ups and downs and ins and outs. But I want to reflect on where we are and then where we're going to go to in the future to really take seriously this climate change challenge. So let's start with what got done or not done in Glasgow in November. First of all, the governments assembled, and we do have a global community there now. Something like 196 countries were present, so a very dramatic representation from nations all across the world. Those governments did agree on something called the Glasgow Climate Pact. And again, a number of you have probably followed this closely, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, except to say my own conclusion is that official government document is quite modest. It does reiterate the urgency of the science and calls out and makes reference to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, most recent 6th assessment report. And that does make clear that while there remain some uncertainties in climate science, we know enough to know we have a real problem and we need to take action at scale and with urgency. And I do think that reality was reflected in the Glasgow Climate Pact. There was, I think, now a new consensus that's emerged that we need to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. By the way, the term mid-century is chosen advisedly. Most countries define that as 2050. A couple do not. China has said it will get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2060, India by 2070. And one of the fascinating things in Glasgow was that when Prime Minister Modi of India announced this commitment to a 27 net zero India, he thought he would be cheered, and instead he was booed. So it does reflect that a broader consensus for faster action has really now emerged. Now, I myself think it's a good thing that India is on board the idea of net zero emissions and starting to take action. But a 50-year further run of fossil fuel burning in India, especially coal burning, would not be a good thing for the planet, nor would 40 more years of that in China. So I think we need to hope that this is a process and we don't lock in as of 2021 everybody's game plan. There will need to be ramping up as the term goes in these negotiations. And there is a need, as we'll discuss, for more ambition. Now, I do think a couple of other things emerged from Glasgow. The official pact notes that there was a 5-year, actually 6-year stock take because the original Glasgow summit was planned to be in 2020. And so we've now, in the 6 years since the Paris Agreement of 2015, been able to gauge whether the country commitments, the so-called nationally determined contributions, are on track to get us where we need to go. And the answer in Glasgow was no, not sufficient. It started to tip the curve in the right direction, but it is not sufficient. And frankly, the issue of how to get more sufficiency was kicked down the road to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt next year. So that is a sign that we still do need more ambition in the climate change game plan in most countries, and certainly as a collective global community. Now, I think what was interesting in Glasgow and got less attention, some of you, again, probably are familiar with this because you watch these issues in great detail, but others might not have been. But there were a series of plurilateral agreements, less than the full global community coming together to make additional commitments. And I note with particular regard and interest that 120 plus countries got together to agree to end deforestation by 2030. And that was a pretty sharp deadline. And there were critical countries like Brazil that signed on. And I do think forests and the ability to take up carbon and have forests be protected as a carbon sink is a part of the pathway to a net zero future. So I think of this agreement as actually quite important. Second major breakthrough in some regards was an agreement on methane. Again, a side agreement, not everyone on board, but 100 plus countries committing to reduce emissions by methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And I think that's important because in the 30 years I've been following climate change, 30 plus, we've never seen methane get the kind of attention that it did in Glasgow. There was, in fact, a whole booth in the conference center declaring itself to be the methane moment. There was a methane day. And it really is now clear that getting quick emissions reductions can most effectively be done by taking out methane. And again, that's because the science of methane has sharpened, and we now understand it to have a radiative forcing, a global warming potential that is not, as we long thought, 30 times greater than carbon dioxide, but depending on how you do the math, perhaps 80 times more important than carbon dioxide, more impact. So getting rid of methane, although it's short-lived, only 10 to 20 years, is a big jump on the kind of reductions we need to move towards net zero by 2050. And I do think the attention in Glasgow and the push on critical industries that are methane emitters is an important breakthrough. Now, in that similar vein, 40 countries committed to end burning coal. And this does not include the United States, nor India, nor China. But it did include Britain, where the heart of the Industrial Revolution began burning coal, actually, ironically, perhaps in Glasgow. So we've got 40 countries saying they're going to end burning of coal by 2030 in the developed world, by 2040 in the developing world. And I do think that is a signal that the end is coming for at least the dirtiest of the fossil fuels, coal, but perhaps more broadly. There was a car agreement where we had 24 automakers in some countries commit to phasing out internal combustions, fossil fuel burning cars and trucks by 2040. Again, interestingly, both Ford and GM signed on to that commitment. So I do think we've got big and important players, critical industry players, seeing the corner being turned towards a non-fossil fuel future and really starting to step up with investments at scale to make it happen in their own industry, in their own company. I would also say there was an agreement, highlight again, a side agreement called the Breakthrough Agenda, focused on delivering innovation in hard to decarbonize sectors. And I think this is fundamental and essential if we're really going to succeed on getting to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And there was a lot of talk about and side events on and discussions around how to decarbonize steel, cement, aviation, ocean shipping, beef, dairy. And that's good news. We need to take up and really bear down on these hard to decarbonize sectors. Now, beyond these side agreements, which really were part of the government conversation, they were governments committing along with others, there were a whole series of side events. Again, those of you who've been to one of these conferences of the parties will know it's a concentric set of circles, an inner circle of governments talking to each other. Just outside that, an official set of NGOs that are authorized to be in the conference center, and many of them have booths and spaces where they're promoting their own ideas for action. And then a set of informal side events in nearby hotels. And then, frankly, there's the street theater where the protesters are. And frankly, in that regard, I do think some of the most important signals from Glasgow came from the street, as I'll mention in a minute. But with regard to side events, I would say, and these are hundreds of events over the course of a couple of weeks, what emerged in my mind most clearly was the seriousness of purpose of so many now in laying out pathways to deep decarbonization. I use that term advisedly, by the way. I know all of you are aware of this. We really should be talking about deep greenhouse gas emissions reduction because it's not just carbon. It is methane. It is some of these other gases. But there were lots and lots of side events, dozens of them, regarding particular countries. And I, for example, was part of a discussion about the pathways to a zero emissions America in 2050. And I've been part of a study over the last couple of years that produced something called America's Zero Carbon Action Plan. And I'm going to have my assistant, Lily, put the ZCAP, as we call it, game plan into our chat. So those who are interested in this particular strategy to deep decarbonization can find the link and look at what we, as a team of 100 researchers across the United States, came up with as a strategy across critical sectors. We laid out a game plan for the power sector, for big industry, for transportation, for buildings, for agriculture and land use, and for materials, all of which need transformation to get us to a net zero 2050. But there were discussions not only at the country scale, but at the sector scale, at the company scale. And one of the remarkable things about the conversation in Glasgow was how quickly the idea of a net zero greenhouse gas world in 2050 as a government commitment cascaded down to industries and companies. So by the end of Glasgow, not just hundreds, but thousands of companies had made net zero greenhouse gas emissions pledges of their own. Now, what was also very interesting is that those pledges were taken with appreciation, but immediately subject to scrutiny, and frankly, even in some cases, some pushback, some skepticism. So there's a lot of focus now on the details of how people are going to get at the country scale, at the company, at the industry scale to net zero in 2050. And there's a lot of requests for interim targets, for information on investments being made, new technologies being developed at the company scale, on business model transformation, on what human resources will be required. And that really was, I think, one of the striking things and promising things to come out of the Glasgow conversation. So let me, if I can, just highlight some of the key themes that I saw, which again, I think are in some regards quite promising, because this is how I think transformative change is going to actually occur. In my mind, one of the most potent elements of the discussion in Glasgow was the emergence and real sharp focus on the need for a just transition, on paying attention to equity issues, or to put it more bluntly, how do we help those who might not be able to afford a transition, or who might in fact be in a community that would suffer negative consequences from the phase out of fossil fuels, come along with the idea that we're moving to a clean energy future. And I think we have underattended to that agenda in the past, and it frankly is the source of some of the political divide that remains challenging all over the world, but especially in the United States. So I do think the idea of focusing on a just transition, and it was probably the #1 overarching theme and conversation in Glasgow, is very important. And for the United States, I think we need a 4-part just transition strategy. Initially, we need to make sure that shifting to a deep decarbonization future doesn't leave the poorest sector of society behind. And when we use things like carbon charges or emissions charges of any kind, it does mean that people at the low end of the income scale may pay more. And we need to figure out how to adjust for that. Second, we do know that some communities, some states even, we can call it the West Virginia effect, have been deeply tied to the fossil fuel past or status quo, and are going to need help redeveloping their path to a clean energy future and their sense of opportunity in that future. So we do need transition strategies for our carbon dependent economy areas. It's not that many people, only 30,000 coal miners, for example. It's not that many counties in the United States, but we've got to devote real resources and have a real strategy for them. And third, I think within the domestic context, it is the case that rural people have a much higher carbon footprint, greenhouse gas emissions footprint, than people in cities. And we're going to need to figure out how to make sure those rural folks don't see this as a plot against them to suppress their already challenged circumstances further. And finally, we do need to have a international just transition strategy. We really can't go where we need to go if we don't bring the developing world along. One could even argue there's a 5th dimension to a just transition, and that involves the process and the need to engage those who've been left out of the conversation. So voices that have not been part of the discussion because they were remote or not organized or not able to devote resources to being part of the discussion, that really could be as a process element, the 5th element, 5th vector of a just transition. A couple of other big themes, and then I want to turn this over to a give and take. I do think we're in a world of growing transparency. And that has several dimensions. People are now being expected to report on their pledges. It's not enough to say we're going to be net zero as a company by 2050. You've got to explain how you're going to do that. What are the interim targets you're going to hit? How is this going to play out? How can people judge whether you're on track? And in that regard, I think we're seeing a growing push for information disclosure. And I'm a big fan of this above and beyond traditional command and control regulation. I think the government should be setting standards for environmental, social, and governance metrics that all publicly traded companies for sure, and maybe all companies of a certain size, should be required to report on. And this, in fact, is a significant part of my research agenda at Yale. We've set up something called the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance. That group has released an ESG white paper, so environmental social governance reporting white paper. And we also have produced a book in the last year called Values at Work, Sustainable Investing and ESG Reporting. So I do think there's a lot to do and a lot of opportunity around disclosure in terms of sustainability performance. Now, I mentioned the street in Glasgow, and there were a lot of street protests and street theater. I actually saw a beautifully enacted wedding of renewable energy and nuclear power. Literally people playing out the roles of bride, nuclear energy, and groom, renewable power, saying that these two elements needed to come together to achieve a clean energy future, and that a significant part of our success with wind and solar power depends on a firm base of power behind that, which nuclear might best provide. So there's a lot of creative spirit and people putting ideas into the global conversation in creative ways, including street theater. But the most dramatic element of kind of voice coming from the street was the protests led by the Swedish activist, youth activist, Greta Thunberg, who paraded around town with a banner saying, "No more blah, blah, blah." And frankly, that became, in some regards, the top quote of the entire Glasgow gathering, the entire COP26. It became a kind of calling card for the idea that the time had come to move from talk to action. And I do think there was a real pushback on the high and the mighty, as well as everybody else, in terms of whether they meant what they were saying and how they were going to follow through on the pledges they were making. And folks that were seen as incongruous on this or inconsistent were called out. There was a whole booth in the conference center devoted to putting up somebody's names in bright lights each day as the fossil of the day, left behind, a dinosaur not keeping up with the need for change. And frankly, it was almost always used to call out somebody who is perceived as being two-faced or disingenuous. The Prime Minister of Norway, for example, talking a good talk about net zero emissions, but then continuing to pump oil and gas out of the North Sea. So there really was, I think, an interesting kind of new focus on making sure people were really committed to and ready to act on the pledges they were making. A fourth big kind of overarching theme was the emergence of the finance world as a critical dimension of what it will take to get to a net zero greenhouse gas emissions future. I have long said, based on my own research at Yale, including my attempts to think about how we improve on our environmental regulatory framework, our environmental performance, that one of the questions we paid too little attention to in the 20th century was where the money will come from to deliver change, to make people more sustainable. Well, in Glasgow, the finance world, the banking world showed up in force. Hundreds and hundreds of bankers from all the big major money center banks and other financial institutions, insurance companies, et cetera. And they were rallied in Glasgow by the former Bank of England governor, Mark Carney. And so 450 or something like that of these financial institutions signed on to something called the Global Finance Alliance for Net Zero, with the not very felicitous acronym of GFANZ, G-F-A-N-Z. But this GFANZ group, representing, as I said, hundreds of big banks and other institutions, with about 130 trillion in assets behind them, said that they were going to do their lending going forward in conformity with the requirements to get to a net zero world by 2050. And the prospect that there will not be finance available for fossil fuel power plants is a huge point of leverage for transformation to a clean energy future. And a final point of kind of overarching theme that I'll highlight, and then I want to turn to my kind of closing thoughts. But I do think there was also a recognition in almost every other institution of scale and size in the world that they needed to pay attention to climate change. They couldn't be disconnected from the global commitment for action, consolidated in Glasgow, but really building on the 2015 Paris Agreement. And so you had, in addition to many CEOs of big companies and industry association leaders, the heads of almost all of the big international organizations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the UN Development Program, of course, the UN Environment Program. But these folks came to Glasgow, not just for an hour or a day to give a speech and go home, but many of them stayed all week, recognizing that the work of the World Bank going forward must be done consistent with the commitment now globally to a net zero greenhouse gas emissions future. And likewise, the new head of the World Trade Organization, the first African and the first woman to head the organization, Ngozi, was there committing that the trading system would be remade to be consistent with the commitment to take action on climate change globally. And all of this, I think, was interesting because it got people talking about not only climate change, but the Sustainable Development Goals, what we needed to be a sustainable society beyond climate change, the need for, and this is again an agenda that's been in the background in the past, now in the foreground, much more focus on adaptation and resilience, big focus on the link with climate change to oceans, and talk about a blue economy and how that might be sustained. A very big focus on the need, as I hinted at, for carbon capture, as well as carbon emissions reduction. So carbon capture in two forms: nature-based solutions, promoting forest growth, frankly, all green plant growth and the process of photosynthesis, but also engineered carbon capture, particularly direct air capture, which we know how to do. It's technologically feasible, just requires a lot of energy to do it. And again, an issue that's emerged that was on the sidelines in the past, almost forbidden to be discussed, because people thought it might take the eye off the ball of emissions reduction, was geoengineering. But I now think a lot of people are saying we better put a side bet on geoengineering, because we don't know if our emissions reduction will proceed as fast and as at scale as is needed. And by the way, for those interested in geoengineering, another Yale colleague, a lecturer there named Wake Smith, has a great book out called Pandora's Toolbox, really looking at the full spectrum of carbon management tools. So here's my bottom line: the keys to what I think a real transformational change toward a clean energy future, towards a fully sustainable future, will require. It starts with policy reform, again, which so many of you know so much about. But we do need to refine and sharpen our policies, do more of what works, re-gear when things are insufficient. The Better Planet book I mentioned earlier really provides a menu of ideas in how this might be done. My own essay in there called Red Lights to Green Lights gives a focus, as Derry mentioned at the outset, on my own view that driving innovation is critical in government policy. And by the way, for those who are interested in my broader agenda for policy reform, I laid this out in a big law journal article, nearly a book, 75 pages. And I apologize for those who view that as too long an article. It really is, but it's a pathology of law scholarship. But again, a piece called Red Lights to Green Lights, published in the law journal called Environmental Law. But it lays out my entire theory of the need for more market mechanisms, more information disclosure and information regulation, the need for, in specific, carbon pricing, greenhouse gas emissions pricing, but a whole series of interventions that might allow us to get toward better policy performance. By the way, Derry's essay, along with John Reeder in this Better Planet book, talks about the process of environmental policy, a great essay called The Environmental Protection Enterprise. Again, something that so many of you are part of. And Derry and John lay out an agenda for how to mobilize and galvanize the environmental protection enterprise for more success. Another element of policy reform I think that's come into sharp focus in recent years is the need to recognize we can't do all the work at the national government level. The federal government of the United States can do some things, but it's politically challenged for sure. And we are going to need to rely on state level action in some cases, a city and town scale in other cases. And frankly, we've got to have a more successful global policy process. I think in Glasgow, we saw the opportunity, but also the limits of the current process. So anyway, policy reform for sure, and thinking about how to really drive change with policy. A second dimension, as I mentioned earlier, a second real point of leverage for change is innovation. I've come to believe that innovation is critical, and not innovation narrowly as technology development, although technology matters. I'm in favor of innovation broadly, innovation in the incentives government provides, innovation in the flow of capital, innovative finance, green bonds, green banks, innovation in how we engage the public, innovation in partnerships. So I think innovation and trying to do things in new and different and better ways is very important. I do think finance is critical, as I said earlier. I think finance is a critical point of leverage for change. And so I'm excited that this Glasgow Alliance for net zero has emerged. And I think figuring out how to make sure that money flows to sustainable enterprises and is pulled back from those that are continuing to be stuck with a fossil fuel past is absolutely essential to the kind of transformative change. I also think that the trade system has to shift. And I was so pleased that the new Director General of the WTO, Ngozi, was there and really digging into the conversation, because that is a fundamental point of reform that's required. I also think that even more fundamentally, the role of business has to change. I'm a big believer that the business community can be harnessed as a source of solutions. There's a lot of innovation capacity in the corporate world, but the foundations of business have to be recast. And in that regard, I've been doing a good bit of work on that topic myself. And for those who are interested in the details, I've just had published with my colleague, Don Elliott, one-time general counsel of the EPA, an article in the NYU Environmental Law Review called the End Externalities Manifesto. And in there, we argue that we need a fundamentally different structure for environmental law based more on rights than benefit cost analysis. And that we really need to have business have an expectation that you cannot have a business model that spills harm, pollution harm in particular, onto the public. And you particularly can't have a business model that socializes costs, pollution up a smokestack, greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, effluent into a river, and privatizes gains, that you get the business benefit, but don't pay for the costs. So I do think we're seeing, and it's very important to the possibility of a sustainable future, a shift, I think, from a long time business expectation that anything that wasn't expressly illegal should be pursued in the pursuit of profits. This idea of shareholder primacy, that corporate leaders should, more than anything else, focus on delivering maximum returns to their owners, to their shareholders, to a world of stakeholder responsibility, that companies have a duty not only to their shareholders, but to their employees, their customers, their suppliers, the communities they operate in, and society more broadly. And again, fundamentally, that it is ethically unacceptable, I think, going forward, for companies to privately gain at public expense. So I do think this is setting us up for a world of greater corporate sustainability, where companies are going to be asked about their sustainability and called to account if they're not keeping up with this new expectation that they will not spill harm as a matter of course onto society as a whole. And finally, sixth point of leverage, I think, is transparency. This is not a choice anyone has to make. It's a reality. We live in a transparent world. The technologies have changed. The world has changed. No company can expect to hide its bad acts, at least not for very long. And I do think this world of information disclosure would be even a more potent point of leverage for movement towards a sustainable future, for action on climate change, if it were better structured. So I do like the idea of the government setting up information requirements. Particularly the SEC could do this for publicly traded companies, but I think the EPA could do it perhaps for a broader set of companies, with expectations that everyone who has got a regulatory obligation should also report on their environmental performance. And some ideas about how this might be structured are in a Yale initiative on sustainable finance white paper, an ESG reporting white paper that's available, and I think we can put up on the chat. So let me close by saying I do think it's an interesting moment to be focused on climate change. I do think there is momentum. I'm actually somewhat optimistic coming out of Glasgow. And as I think you've heard me say, not so much because of what the governments agreed to in the Glasgow Climate Pact, but what occurred in the side agreements and came out in the side events and kind of was manifest in the energy in the streets of Glasgow. And I do think, and this is where I'll close, that the real test of whether COP26 was a success depends on what unfolds over time. And I want to recall for you something that the great Canadian businessman diplomat, chair of the original 1972 Earth Summit, the original Earth Summit in Stockholm, who was brought back in 1992 as the chair of the Rio Earth Summit, Morris Strong, said to me as he came to visit Bill Riley in the spring of 1992, as we were closing out the Framework Convention on Climate Change that was completed in April of 92, looking towards a gathering in June of 1992 in Rio for this Earth Summit. And Morris Strong took me aside as we waited for Bill Riley and said, Dan, I got to tell you, I'd asked him about what his expectations were. He said, well, there's only two possibilities when the world community comes together as they are going to come together in Rio in June. He said, when you gather all these presidents and prime ministers, and at the time, the 120 presidents and prime ministers that had committed to come to Rio was the largest gathering of global leaders ever. He said, when we have all these presidents and prime ministers and all their cabinets and all of the media attention that will be there, thousands of journalists, not to mention thousands and thousands of NGOs, he said only two possibilities in terms of outcome: success and real success. And sadly, Morris Strong was right. The Rio program, the 1992 Framework Convention were quote unquote success. People declared success, but frankly, it did not deliver over the intervening decades. And I think the question now is, does the Paris Agreement of 2015 provide a foundation? And does the Glasgow COP26 add-on move us now to a point of real momentum, of real transformative change that will deliver, not in the short run, but out over the next several decades, real success in getting society galvanized for climate change action and on a path, taking decades, but toward a clean energy and fully sustainable future. So with that, let me pause and take your questions, comments, feedback, pushback, and really jump into a conversation.
Well, thank you, Dan, very much. That's a very good summary, going very quickly through a great deal of material. I want to just pick up on your idea of real success. And while we're waiting for a couple of questions to come in, you reflected back on the process since Earth Summit in 1992, and you mentioned the COP27 coming up in November in Egypt. And John Kerry said this week that we're not on track to meet global goals, particularly in global coal use. And the Egyptians are concerned very much with the needs of developing countries. I'm just wondering if you want to kind of look ahead a little bit, not only on specific policies, but on the process, looking back since 1992 to now and looking forward. What has to happen to the process to achieve what Morris Strong was talking about when he said real success?
So Derry, I should actually turn the question around because I know you've thought about this a lot too, in terms of process change.
That's why I asked. Well,
I will let you then add comments on. I think there is real reason to worry that the COP process has too much weight put on it at this point. I actually think there's value in having an annual gathering of the parties to this convention, the 1992 convention. I'm sure everyone on this call knows this, but a lot of folks I talk to don't realize that COP26 refers to the 26th annual gathering of the parties to the original 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I think there's value in gathering that group. I think it does provide a kind of target date to get certain things done by, although we see the world community blow past those dates all the time. There was meant to be an adding up of emissions reductions commitments by 5 years after Paris that would be sufficient to the scientific projection of what was required. We didn't hit that. We didn't come close. But I do think there needs to be some further kind of structure and process around the critical countries. And frankly, I think what the lesson I take from the story I've just laid out is it's actually not always country scale action that is what's required. And I think, many of us who've been in government and served in a national government's environment agency have thought that we were the critical place that change was going to be driven from. And, first on my list of points of leverage is policy. But I'm also very much focused on these other points of leverage. A good number of them go beyond what governments can do or even control. So I think the process, as I see it going forward, needs to be a more comprehensive one that takes account of what can be and should be asked of the business community, and some accountability in the business community that looks more sharply at what the finance world is saying and doing. And again, tries to structure a set of expectations that they can be held accountable for and report on. And I do think we should be anticipating that government action is not just federal government action, but state government action, city scale action. So I do think the process needs to be broader and more all-encompassing. I have written on and have argued that we need as much of a bottom-up delivery on climate change commitments as we have top-down direction setting. So I do think some change in the process is necessary.
Well, thank you. That's a great answer. And that's picking up on the finance part of that you were just mentioning. I have a question here from Steve Young. He says, Dan, you mentioned the finance banking involvement of at Glasgow, GFANZ. Did you see meaningful action coming out of the insurance and reinsurance community? E.g., we pledge we will not insure climate damaging risks by date certain.
Answer in short, no. There were insurance company folks there, but they were not rallied and unified the way that the GFANZ group had been pulled together by Mark Carney. So I think there is an opportunity. Frankly, having been commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, where Hartford had long been the insurance capital of America, I had tried in my time as commissioner to get the insurance industry moving, and they just were not interested. So it was quite challenging because there was international interest, particularly among the reinsurance folks like Swiss Re, Munich Re. But the American insurance companies were really tough to mobilize. And I was surprised because change that is not kind of linear, that is to say, dislocation style change of the sort climate change can cause, is really what throws insurance into trouble, because predictable risks they can manage. Unpredictable risks are very tough. So I would have thought that the insurance industry would step up, but it was not evident to me in Glasgow that they were.
Oh, thank you. Another question here from Dave Ulrich. You talked about measuring progress, and Dave is asking if you can talk more about how progress will be measured and reported, and accountability will be established. I mean, it's one thing to just say we've got to measure, we've got to put it out there, transparent. But can you say more about how it really ought to be measured in ways that are meaningful, not only to the globe, but to companies and other actors?
So I do think this is where there's a role for government, and perhaps a slightly different role for government than we might have anticipated in the past, and roles for other actors that are part of the disciplinary process, the accountability process. So I do believe that we should have a structured reporting framework for all companies of a certain scale that has a set of categories under E, environment, S, social, and G, governance. So ESG is the way the investment world thinks about this. And I think that structure of reporting should not just be by category, but by, in addition, underlying methodologies. It's not enough to say you should report on your greenhouse gas emissions. We need to have people say you must report scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And oh, by the way, we need to define what those scopes are. I am shocked by how much of the existing data out in the finance marketplace around ESG metrics related to companies is not on a methodologically consistent basis. This is really quite shocking. Some companies report under scope 3 just their business travel. That's not very helpful. And by the way, ExxonMobil just did a big thing about how it had pledged to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, but only on scopes 1 and 2, which is not, if you're an oil company, what anyone cares about. It's the burning of the fuel as your product. So, this is where the lack of a kind of common standard, and therefore the lack of comparability, and therefore the difficulty of doing company-to-company benchmarking is an issue. And I would love to see the government structure this information marketplace in a way that would ensure that all the folks who care about this, the finance world, the investors, a growing number of consumers that want to bring an environmental lens to their purchases, would have a trusted source of information. And frankly, I do think as an enforcement matter, the government should audit the information that's being put forward and penalize disinformation or misinformation. And again, for those who are interested, the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance ESG white paper gives my detailed view of how this might be done. with 3 tiers of information: a top tier of common metrics across all companies, a second tier that is industry specific, recognizing that what you might want to know about in banking versus mining will be different. And every other industry has some variations that need to be tracked specific to that industry. And a third layer of the platform being company specific, kind of in effect narrative strategy. I think over time, being able to look with some granularity at how a management team anticipates that it will lead this transformation process, how it will change its business model to be sustainable, to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, will be enormously important. Again, important to investors for sure, because not every company and not even every industry makes it through this transformation of the next 20 years. And a lot of consumers would like to know too, are you betting on a company that's thinking hard about this, moving in the right direction? Or are you buying products from folks who are adding to the problem, not becoming solutions providers? So I really do think government has a role to play, but the real force here may well come from those investors. When Larry Fink, who's the head of BlackRock, the world's largest investment manager, declares that he's going to start pulling resources back from companies that are unsustainable, that are not clear on their pathway to a net zero greenhouse gas emissions future, that's a force in some regards bigger than government. And I do think we want to harness all of these forces, the power of investors, the power of consumers, the capacity of government to insist on certain standards. It's that collective set of what I call points of leverage that I think can drive transformative change.
Yes, it's almost an immovable rock there until you get all those players, particularly those in the investment community. I just know from experience how hard it is to get a new program like that going in government. It's very, very difficult. So I appreciate that answer.
Well, and I do think, by the way, just to go back to the core business of so many on this call, I think there is a scope for sharpening policy as well. And I do think all of you who have been engaged or continue to be engaged in environmental protection, environmental policy making, should be helping to think about how we really take our current framework of law and sharpen it. And by the way, I've just got a book out literally in the last couple of weeks from Elgar, the publisher, called An Advanced Introduction to U.S. Environmental Law, done with Don Elliott again. And I'm interested if any of you get a chance to have a look at it, whether you think we're pushing in the right direction. Because I think there is a real need for us all who've been steeped in this framework of environmental law to be reflective now and step back and ask, not just what is the framework and is it being applied, but how could it be sharpened, made better, made more effective? And I would urge a number of you who've been in this arena for decades, sometimes 40 years, to give us, especially those of you who might have a little bit more time now in retirement, give us your view on the piece of the law you know, or the comprehensive view of the law of how it could be refined and reformed for more effect going forward.
Well, that's great. And I do recognize a number of lawyers on this call. So there's an opportunity. And I hope.
Well, Gary, let me add that this is not an invitation just to lawyers. I think some of our non-lawyer but environmental policy experts have given as much thought to this question as any lawyer and are well positioned to give us their view as well.
Good point.
I do want to pick up one quick question that I see in the chat, Gary, and it's about the Supreme Court. And I do think we've got a tough challenge in terms of, and this is one of the reasons why I don't rely on the federal government alone, and I don't rely on environmental law or policy alone to drive change, because I think we have a Supreme Court that is structured now in a way that is at risk of undermining some of the incentives that are being structured and brought to bear using the existing legal framework. And the question, in fact, is focused on the Clean Air Act, Section 111D, which I do think was an important kind of authority that could have been used to drive change, but we have a Supreme Court that may have narrowed what that can look like, and that is a challenge. And I do think we've got to figure out creative ways around some of these obstacles.
Yes. John Armstead has a question on a slightly different topic. that I think is very important. And you did get at this a bit earlier. He says, what are some of the specific actions developed nations can undertake to assist developing countries to advance towards net zero carbon economy?
So one of the other things that I've become convinced is that the success here requires action across the full spectrum, from developed to developing, and with different speeds of change and different strategies of change, but with certainly some commitment of finance from the developed to the developing. I've been working a lot over the last year with Denmark, and I have to say it's quite a joy to have a country with a government that is broadly reflective of left to right across the political spectrum, that wants to be a sustainability leader. And it is important, I think, for those who can move faster than the rest to go out in front and demonstrate what's possible so the rest of us can follow. In fact, in my own work in Connecticut as commissioner, one of the things we learned was that change is much easier when you see your neighbor do it. We were looking at what it would take to get someone to put up solar arrays, and it turned out financing was helpful, incentives were important, information was useful, but the most important thing was to see your neighbor with a solar array on the roof. And when you saw that, you said, well, I think I'm as good as the Joneses. If they can do it, I can do it too. And I do think in that regard, when a country like Denmark runs out in front and shows that it can move towards a substantial renewable energy foundation to its power sector, others say, well, maybe we can do it too. Likewise, at the developing country end of the spectrum, we need to do more capacity building, and we need to help countries at various scales of that economic ladder to take the next step up. And we certainly want to be sure that as countries are moving up that economic development ladder, that their investments, particularly in long-time infrastructure, 30, 40-year power generation equipment, is on a basis that will be sustainable. And I think we don't have a comprehensive strategy in that regard. One other point of leverage that I didn't mention, but I take seriously, is philanthropy. And it may well be we're going to need to mobilize more non-government capital to help the developing world, especially with creative thinking. And at the current moment, the level of government assistance to the developing nations is way short of whatever would really drive transformative change.
Thank you. Stan Ryberg has a question on the innovation imperative. What specific areas beyond technological development provide both the greatest opportunities and the greatest urgency?
So Stan, my own answer to that question is that I think we need innovation, as we were just discussing, in finance. I think we need green bonds, we need green banks, which, as you heard from Derry, I set one up in Connecticut. I think we need creative finance structures of various kinds to really get the money into the hands of the folks that are making critical decisions. And again, what I'm hoping to see is an ability to change the choice that a government makes from building a coal-fired power plant or even a natural gas-fired power plant to investing the extra money that would be required to build a wind farm or set up a large-scale solar array. So I do think we need to get finance to kind of tip people that are on the margin towards a clean energy opportunity. And that is not trivial amounts of money, and it is almost certain to involve some mix of public and private resources. Public resources because it can in effect subsidize private capital, and private capital because the scale of government money is almost certainly going to be too little. So we need blended finance. And I do think, that if there's a single thing I can point to coming out of Glasgow, it was the sense that the finance world was now stepping up. So innovation in finance is number one. I also think we need innovation in communications. We have, as a society, allowed climate change to become the ultimate wedge issue, where the two parties can't even talk about it in the same words. And I do think we need to think about how to engage different segments of the public innovatively and pull them into a conversation that they can understand. And I'll just give you again a sliver of this, but it needs much greater thought and depth than we can probably sort out here this afternoon. But I do think, and we saw it in this past week in Florida, that a conversation around resilience can get Republicans as well as Democrats. And I do think if we could figure out how to transform the climate change conversation into a broader discussion that brings on board folks who otherwise couldn't see themselves as supporting the agenda, would be valuable. And there's some good social science work on this. It turns out if you get an issue that ends up with sharp identity around certain solutions, so renewable power seen as a left-wing solution, it's trouble. So I would, and I favor, bringing nuclear power into the equation of how we get to a clean energy future. It turns out that people on the political right are much more excited about taking action on climate change if you tell them that nuclear power is part of the program. And that's a compromise I'm willing to make. I think fundamentally what's really needed, and this is where creative thinking is required, innovation is required, it will not be possible to relay the energy foundation of our society on a one-party does it basis. We've got to find a way to make it more bipartisan. And so I'm particularly interested in innovation that would get us to political bridging of bringing together not the whole of the Republican Party and not the whole of the Democratic Party probably, but some significant part of both in what could be a common strategy.
Thank you. Frank Princiata has a question. He says, my analysis suggests a price on carbon is the most impactful action that could be taken at the global and national level. Why wasn't this seriously considered? This is obviously something that has been talked about a great deal over the past, couple of decades, but there's nothing much that we've been hearing about it out of Glasgow. Can you talk about that and what's the future for that idea?
So Frank, I agree with you. I do think the evidence is now overwhelming that the most effective tool in the environmental policymakers' toolbox is pricing. And the incentives pricing provides for changed behavior, for investments in innovation, for deployment of capital. And so I do think a greenhouse gas emissions price would be enormously effective and valuable. By the way, Jerry, just to pick a little bit on your question, I do think this is under discussion in many countries. In fact, if you look at the nationally determined contributions of the 190 plus countries that have made climate change action plans visible, most have some element of pricing. And especially among our peer countries. If you look at the OECD 30 countries, I think 25 have pricing as part of their package. So we are a little bit, as the United States, behind the curve in having been so hesitant. And by the way, we do have some of this at the state level. We do have in the Northeast a carbon pricing tool. And we've got in California a carbon cap and trade mechanism in place. So and by the way, those have both been demonstrated to be very effective. The greenhouse gas emissions reductions are much greater in the RGGI states, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative states, the Northeast and in California, than in the rest of the country. And it has created a pool of money for investments in energy efficiency and in renewable power. So I think even as people say, well, it doesn't work, it's not true. It really does work. And if you look rigorously at the data, it works very effectively. But I think that the challenge has been that for the longest time, the Democrats were pushing this and they felt they got slaughtered politically for it, beginning with the Waxman-Markey bill that resulted in, at least some would say, the House flipping to be Republican in the next election cycle. Ironically, I think as of 2020, there was a moment where you could have done a bipartisan pricing strategy, as there were a number of Republicans ready for climate action, particularly if it were done on a market-based approach. And I think the Biden administration decided it wouldn't go there because they felt the political risk was too great. So I'm still hopeful that there will be a return to this agenda, perhaps as other climate change pathways forward are blocked. And it does appear to me that a significant number of the ways the Biden administration thought it would advance the ball here are not going to be available. And they're going to have to rethink. And I'm with those who believe that part of a package, not the only element, but a part of a package, and frankly, an important part of the package for climate progress should be a climate price. My own strategy in this regard to address some of the political challenges would be a slowly rising greenhouse gas emissions price. beginning at $5 per ton and rising $5 per ton per year for 20 years, locked in, no change possible, and getting to a terminal price of $100 per ton. Why I like that is that the short-term dislocation is minimized because the $5 and then $10 and then $15 price is not so significant as to cause those who are paying it to fight to the death against the approach. They are not going to try to derail the train. And in fact, I think it would get a lot of folks on board if they got a 20-year phase in. It also means that people have already made choices, like bought a car last year, are not penalized excessively for a choice made on a basis of different assumptions about energy pricing. And I do think the other advantage is that anyone who's making an investment prospectively looking forward looks not at the year 1, 2, 3 price of $5, $10, $15 per ton, but for something like a factory or a power plant or anything of long duration, they look at the end price, the $100 price, and it dramatically reshapes their thinking about how to build their factory or their building or their power plant. And so I think a slow scale up carbon charge could be very effective. And it would, of course, generate resources that have lots of ways to create opportunities for political coalitions that right now don't seem possible. I have joked, and I'm only half joking, that it would be a great deal if we could get this slowly rising carbon charge put in place. And that if I were a leader of the Democratic Party, I would offer the Republicans, if they were to sign on, the chance to decide how all the revenue got spent. And some people get, oh my God, that's a horrible idea. But my view is it would be so valuable to get this pricing structure in place and locked in. And there are so many good ways to spend the money, not very many bad ways to spend it, that I'd be willing to give the Republicans free rein over what the outcome over the spend side of the equation would be, so long as they stay together and on board the idea that the structure would be put in place and stay in place.
Oh, that's good. We have a question from Tom DeVonzo talking about Build Back Better and what's been happening with that in Congress, and what if you can just talk more about the what that might mean for the ability of the U.S. to meet its climate goals. Is that going to be a really big thing in terms of meeting climate goals, or is because of the other kinds of actions that you've been talking about today, does it not turn out to be as big of a thing?
Well, I remain optimistic that some elements of the Build Back Better agenda still might move. It looks to me like the Biden administration is going to try to peel apart the pieces now, and that one of the pieces that could actually be advanced on a standalone or limited basis would be the climate change dimensions. I continue to believe that probably there is going to need to be a significant subsidy of investments in clean energy. And I do think clean energy, by the way, in contrast with climate change, clean energy does rally some number of Republicans. And I think one could imagine a climate change strategy that is centered on investment in and incentives for clean energy that could assemble majorities of House and Senate to get a bill passed. So I guess I'm hopeful, but not confident that there will be some climate change pieces of the Build Back Better agenda that move through the Congress in the coming year. But with politics sharpening and midterms elections looming, one can't count on any cooperation of any sort across parties. And that, frankly, is both sad and a fundamental threat, I think, to the functioning of our democracy over time. But that's where we are in terms of tough politics.
We have probably time for one more question. Kind of looking at what you've been saying about our experience in addressing climate change, what effect do you think that will have on the way that we approach environmental protection for other issues? I'm speaking of the classic air pollution, water pollution issues that so many of us spend a lot of time working on. Do you think that our experience in climate change is, for instance, going to help us move from red lights to green lights?
Well, I do think, and again, just to explain the red lights to green lights, that we spent a lot of time in the past telling people what not to do. Don't pollute, don't do this, don't do that. And what we really need to do is to engage business in particular in problem solving and provide incentives to invest in solutions to these problems. So I do think there would be a value in using some of the same tools, some of the same commitment to innovative thinking around green lights, signals to business about where their creative capacities and innovative energy might be devoted. And I do think, just as we're talking about carbon charging or greenhouse gas emissions charging being useful for the incentive it creates for the ability to drive resource flows, I think a price on emissions generally is a good thing. Air pollution, water emissions. And my own view is that, and again, this is what's laid out in the End Externalities Manifesto, this NYU Environmental Law Review piece. I think we've spent too much time trying to guess what the right level of emissions to accept would be with some kind of background of benefit cost analysis. And I'd rather establish a new principle that no emissions are acceptable, and that while it might have been technologically difficult to imagine that 50 years ago when we launched the modern environmental legal framework with the 1970 Clean Air Act and the 1972 Clean Water Act and the whole array of laws that followed in the next decade, today it's not so hard to imagine a zero emission standard. And I would provide an override that if you couldn't get to zero, you could pay for the harm you're causing, but every bit of emissions is charged for. And I think a new framework, a new baseline that says net zero is applied not only to climate change, but to all emissions would be a good thing, and would give us a kind of a new structure of incentives that would drive fresh thinking and transformative investments in a way that would, I think, help us get to the next stage of a much cleaner, even a regenerative strategy of environmental law and policy for the years ahead.
Well, thank you, Dan. And it is 5:15. I give you a chance to say any closing words that you like, but we advertised that we go to 5:15. So anything you want to just add at the end?
Only to say again, a huge thank you, Derry, to you, to Chuck, to Beth, and the entire team that put this together, and for the whole of the EPA Alumni Academy team, who I think are doing such a wonderful job of engaging all of us in an ongoing conversation. So thanks to all of you. And again, thanks to so many of you who I worked with and am friends with for signing in today. And it's really been a joy to be part of the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your taking time to talk with us. And we hope to be in touch with you in the future. So appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.